Hey everyone, welcome to the show. My name is Maddie, aka Beaver Mosh. Uh, Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Andrew Wilson of Pyres, who has a new album coming out, Yun. And by time you watch this, it will be out on Hypaethral Records. Now, Andrew, thank you for taking the time to do this with me. How excited are you to finally get this record out?
Super stoked to finally see it out into the wild. We've got two singles out currently streaming that are doing pretty well, and people seem to be responding to it. Yeah, we're stoked. It's been a long time coming. Some of these songs have been kind of in the bag for a long time,
Yeah.
and you know, we our last record was 2013. Not entirely sure how that happened, but we can get into that. Uh, yeah, we'll get to the bottom of that.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up because that was kind of the first thing I was going to ask you is that like you put out your first LP, Year of Sleep, as you mentioned back in 12 years ago, 2013. So why now? Why 2025? Why is it time now to follow up with your second album?
We can go back to sort of 2013 to start, and just to sort of lay the foundations for how we sort of ended up where we are. So that record came out in July of 2013, but in April, prior to the release of the record, my sister was killed in a murder suicide.
Mm.
So the celebration of the momentum and the rollout of that record, it received a lot of great press, and it landed with a lot of people. But myself as a person, I didn't really know. I didn't at the time have the tools to sort of guide the band in a direction that it probably needed to go. We didn't sort of seize the opportunity. So we continued to play shows locally, and it was nice to have a record that was well received and kind of highly regarded, but we just kind of didn't know what direction. There was sort of a directionlessness there. I continued to write, but there was also sort of an aimlessness there. So the writing process took a long time, and I'm almost kind of glad that the writing process took the length of time that it did, though, because where we
Sure.
are now is sort of I'm more comfortable at 40 than at 27 addressing the subject matter that's on this record, and sort
Yeah.
of it's not a closure, it's not, but there is sort of a resolution to my feelings and how I'm able to sort of marry those feelings with the music. Maybe more so as an adult, it's I'm more open to the process of that.
Yeah, and from my understanding, a lot of this material on this record is very personal, very autobiographical.
Yeah,
You want to talk about that a little bit?
yeah, sure. So we'll start with the album title itself.
Yeah.
I was inspired by my partner, the mother of my child, had been taught, one of the many sort of dialectic translations of the word yan is like sort of to contain and to store, or to sort of hold in strength. On the negative, it's to repress emotions or to hide your feelings, and there's a positive spin that was suggested to me that's also sort of to exemplify inner strength.
Hmm.
So that stuck with me, and we had very lengthy conversations. My partner and I was like, can I sort of, would you allow me to sort of use that concept, that she was taught to sort of almost repress her emotions growing up? Can I tie my story of loss and trauma and grief with, my partner's story of sort of emotional repression almost?
Yeah.
Um, and then the lyrics to the songs themselves are particularly autobiographical in my case. Um, the narrative is sort of a bit jumbled from one song to the next. Obviously, the conversations between band members is like I had a sort of a throughway, like there was sort of pathway from one song to the other that was in my mind, and one of the members in the band was just like, "Dude, that is too much. Like we gotta chop this up." It's just like an assault the
Yeah.
first like three songs. So um, yeah, it's taken a long time to sort of get to a place of comfort to be able to address these things sort of, and feel confident about that, and feel sort of connected personally to not just the badass riffs, but to be able to
Yeah.
connect personally to the music that you're writing, especially within sort of metal, where
Yeah.
there's a lot of bravado or I don't want to say posturing, but there's people kind of puff out their chest and
Oh yeah. I've been to enough metal shows and seen
inhabits
this.
sort of inhabiting like a persona sometimes or whatever,
Yeah.
and that's part of the art and the expression. But I feel like with this record, I'm pretty confident that we're able to inhabit a very earnest and sincere place with the lyrics, and still, like, obviously have fun playing badass riffs and stuff too.
Absolutely. Um, just a quick question, beyond you talked about it a little bit. Where geographically is the origin of that word?
Chinese,
Chinese?
Cantonese.
Okay, cool, yeah. Awesome. In what ways are you a different band than the band that put out your first record in 2013? How have you evolved over a decade?
I'll answer that question in two ways.
Yeah.
Because we are still very much the same lineup, although we are certainly in different places in life. So 2/3 of the band, the current lineup, now have kids.
Hmm.
Some of us own their own businesses. We're very much in different places in life. Like I think in the early days, while we did end up sort of putting out a fairly fine record that we're still pretty proud of, it was kind of beer league a little bit. Like we were just, we just start at the bar, hit the jam space, party there, go back to the bar afterwards,
Hmm.
and just like hope to play some sick shows.
Yeah.
Now it's sort of like, okay, guys, here's sort of like the itinerary. This is what we want to be doing in June and July and August, and we're going to be doing this interview. And it's, I don't want to say that it's run more like a business, but I think it's just run properly now.
Sure.
Yeah, and this year has been by far the most productive year we've ever had, just in terms of like playing shows, recording, writing, recording more, speaking with people such as yourself, and it's kind of, I'm kind of enjoying the flow now.
Sure.
Yeah,
Um, Now you're probably, at least from most places and from hearing your music, probably best described as like a sludge metal band.
sure.
But with that, I am hearing, especially kind of in the vocals, but in a lot of aspects, hearing some strong hardcore punk influences. Is that intentional?
Yeah, that's 100% intentional. I mean, that's our background. My bass
Yeah.
player Devin and I have, I mean, we're still going to hardcore shows and stuff all these years later, and I just like to sort of, if I'm going to spend all this time, and in this case, this record was also kind of expensive. If I'm going to invest all of the free time that I have and the energy that I have to devote to art of any
Hmm.
kind, it's just got to be a representation of the people in the band, I think. And like, we'll sneak a D beat into one of our songs, and we'll have a Thin Lizzy part, or it's like, I think, what was it? Darkness Comes Alive by Doom Riders was kind of like a big record for me when it came out. And there was all those like sick harmonies, but there was also Nate Newton's vocals, and he's still a hardcore
Yeah.
dude. And I just love that sort of the marriage of like Skate Rat with Thin Lizzy riffs with,
Yeah.
heavy riffs. It was just, so I don't know. We're kind of, as people and musicians, we're kind of all over the place, but I feel like maybe it's because you had the same person doing vocals all the time, but the package, I feel like we kind of have a thing that we can sort of say, hey, this is kind of the collection of influences that we call our own. This is what we do, right?
Yeah. Thin Lizzy, you mentioned. That's an interesting mention. Is it kind of the some of the guitar melodies, dual, like kind of dual? Are you taking like the dual guitar thing that Thin Lizzy does, or like what is it? What from Thin Lizzy are you
There's
borrowing?
Yeah, definitely the dual guitar harmonies. I mean, if we're in the studio and we're writing a part, and I hear my guitar player Mark, start working on something, I will like immediately want to figure out a harmony to that. And
Mm,
it's not just because it's kind of cool and metal, and obviously it's very common in metal. It's not a Thin Lizzy thing necessarily, but um I think that's just I have a the way my brain works is I always want to build on melodies.
Hmm.
So it's kind of an addiction of mine. It's like, oh, that's sick. We should add a harmony. And in the case of the new record, I even harmonized vocals as well.
Okay.
Like I layered vocals in some ways and added some harmonies and stuff, which is kind of a first for myself.
Yeah, when you think metal and you think dual army, then I think at least the first example that comes to my mind is Iron Maiden's The Trooper. Like
Of
just like
course, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah, for sure, yeah. I don't know why. I guess in our jam space when we say Thin Lizzy, maybe it's just because it's like there's like an earnestness there that's not too showy. It's just kind of there for the song. So we're not
right.
like harmonizing a 2 minute solo. We're kind of just it's baked into the riff, which is sort of
Mhm.
the Thin Lizzy approach, as opposed to
Right.
like the showmanship. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now I want to ask you, of course, what was the experience working with Brad Boatwright? For those who are familiar watching, someone who has been in the industry, has worked with a lot of doom bands, sludge bands, really heavy metal in general, but like knows how to make big sounding riffs, which I think is like big for like
Yeah.
a band of your type. Has worked with bands such as Sleep and Yob and many others. What was that like? What was he able to bring out of your band?
Well, Brad Boatwright was in charge of the mastering for the record. So the record was engineered in two places with Simon Larachette at the Sugar Shack. So we did percussion in London, Ontario with Simon, and then
Yeah.
we did guitars, bass with Greg Dawson at BWC. So that's now the second time that our record's been produced by Greg.
Yeah.
And then as far as Brad Boatwright, to answer your question, when it came time to master, I was like, I wonder if we could get Brad. I wonder if we could do with Audio Siege because, I mean, For Mash's Rise was one of my favorite bands growing up, and
Yeah.
just the opportunity to work. And I mean, his body of work is incredible. So it was like, we worked with the producer that we wanted to work with, and we ended up getting the mastering done by somebody that we really admire. So we were stoked on that. We feel like it just happened to be like of a lucky window of time where like he wasn't booked up or something.
Yeah. I I doing a lot of band interviews. I Something I've learned with the years I've been doing this show is that like you see these iconic people that are like known for being behind, the turn the knobs, sorry, I couldn't get the word out. But um
Yeah,
they you think that they are so like distant, like they're just like these like people that are just like, stories about them, but they're not actually like tangible, but actually how accessible they are, and bands can just kind of reach out to them and they're willing and they're wanting to just work with metal bands.
absolutely. And in the
Yeah.
case of Audio Siege, it was very like workmanlike. It was just like I sent an email, I got an email back that had like a form to fill. I filled out the form and then sent the mixes, and that's how that process started. So there wasn't a lot of like, I mean, I did send an initial message just like, I'm a huge fan of yours, man. Can you please master our record? But you're right. There's certain luminaries in the community that kind of pop up, and like here in Toronto, one of our good friends is Sean from Blood Ceremony,
Yeah,
and
great band.
he's like, you guys should go record with Sanford Parker, or just go to like Electrical Audio. And I was like, I mean, seriously? He's like, yeah, like they work just like anybody else does, you know.
Mm.
And it's just funny because obviously, Blood Ceremony are a fairly successful band who are maybe more likely to have these relationships with like some of these bigger producers in metal. But it's like, yeah, you just book some time and go record at one of these studios. That's their job. They're just well known
Yeah.
for doing their job. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, when you think of like some of those like iconic death metal records that came out in Tampa at the time, that wasn't a big thing. So none of the bands were like big names. They were all just getting this iconic producer and
Yeah.
doing it. So yeah.
Yeah. And so in some cases, it's just like the one person who's like really good at that one thing, and everyone just
Hmm.
in that small community all, so you end up with like the Florida death metal sound because of that community surrounding that one person who's doing that thing for
Yeah.
everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a cool thing to talk about, and it's also just cool to think about. I mean, obviously other genres is too. I think hip hop clearly, talks about like, the producers a lot, but I think metal for like is really good at like understanding the role of the producer and the role of the person who masters, and like gives them credit and make sure like, yeah, part of why this sounds so good is not just the people credited as like playing instruments on the record, but who
Sure.
worked on it behind the scenes.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a trust there as well. Like with Greg
Mm.
Dawson, I mean, he's here in Ontario. He's a legend, and he's put out hundreds of great records. And there was no question here in our scene. I mean, the guy's booked up a year in advance.
Mhm.
You know, in the best case scenario, he's booked up about a year in advance, and we just sort of mapped out like, okay, he's available 2 days here, 2 days here. So recording with Greg at BWC was spread out throughout the year, but we were just determined because he's going to take the time. He's familiar with the band.
Yeah.
He knows kind of like if he's because he just did recently the most recent Panzerfaust record, and that's just like so different than what we do. It's like
Yeah.
just brutal black metal, and it's huge. It still sounds crazy heavy, but it's got a lot of really layered subtle things happening
Yeah.
at that BPM. So he's just able to kind of slide from one subgenre to the other, and we just trust that. It's like um, it's interesting when you're from sort of a certain kind of corner of the spectrum. Sometimes when you hear like a black metal record, for example, produced by a person, you can kind of almost go widescreen and go, okay, that the producer knew what that band was looking for,
Yeah.
so they're gonna know what we're looking for, even if we're not sort of playing that style of music. I don't. Yeah, it's yeah, building that trust is a really cool thing.
Yeah. And you're mentioning a little bit of bands and people, from the Toronto area where you are from. Um, I know, I mean, I know I mean, I'm not from Toronto, but I know of a lot of bands from Toronto. I know that the metal scene there is pretty big, but like in your experience, what is it like playing in that particular, scene, the Toronto metal scene?
Yeah, it's definitely it's diverse for
Yeah.
sure. There's we do have a pretty good wealth of venues, and there's a lot of hardworking promoters who are kind of they're really sort of I wouldn't say tastemakers, but like pushing things forward all the time, and there's a lot of hard work that's kind of happening behind the scenes. Um, it's hard for me to say because we fit into sort of a funny weird place where like we can play with sort of stoner rock bands, and that seems to be, at least in my case, in my experience, having like a huge resurgence in Toronto. So like a lot of like Sabbath worship, and kind of as even more on the Paisley sort of psychedelic side.
Yeah.
But then we also have like we have Fanny Faxeth and Panzerfaust. We have huge, black metal bands that are pretty well known around the world. And Toronto's a huge metropolitan city. It's extremely sort of diverse, and that's going to be reflected in even the metal community and the subgenres.
Yeah, and you mentioned Blood Ceremony, huge band in kind of that psych rock,
Yeah,
stonery kind of occult metal. Like I think probably, yeah, like you said, it kind of bringing back that sound that's just been like weirdly popular lately, and nobody
yeah.
really
I
saw it
mean,
coming. Yeah.
they were kind of they've been hitting it for a long time. I mean, I think the first record was like 15 years ago now, but
2008, yes.
2000, yeah. And yeah, I don't know. There was definitely when we came out, we were coming from sort of a hardcore background, and sludge metal is sort of informed somewhat by hardcore, and we sort of in sort of our initial birthing period, we were playing a lot more kind of wacky, kind of arty noise rock, sludge. I wouldn't, not necessarily avant garde, but it was like very diverse, and I feel like there's there's been more of a kind of a clear cut, like, okay, sort of stoner rock and doom metal is big again in Toronto. Um, but in that regard, we're kind of we stick out in certain ways because we typically play a bit faster, and there's
Hmm.
some a lot of different genre elements combined in what we do. We kind of still probably mostly play sort of stoner rock and doom metal shows, but
Yeah, well, let's talk about the diversity in your sound because we've talked about the obviously sludge and stoner aspects that are very at the forefront. We've talked about the hardcore elements, but something that I also notice about your sound is kind of this emphasis on not and just the atmosphere and also like the melodic component. Like there are sections that like feel more like a post rock album.
yeah,
There's a lot going on there that I think just like differentiates you from just like I don't know a Mastodon clone.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's always like early
Yeah,
Baroness, Mastodon, and High on Fire that gets thrown around as our influences, but like,
yeah.
yeah, Russian Circles. I like Explosions in the Sky. I want to use delay pedals. I want to have pretty passages, like pretty or like earnest or I don't know, kind of beautiful in
Hmm.
some ways. Those aren't like dirty words. Like those are part of the lexicon. Like in our band, it's like I'm not afraid of like major melodies or parts that sound kind of almost like I don't know wholesome. um, yeah, they're not faux pas, they're not dirty words for us. And I think it's just also there's an excitement in the band. You can hear it. Like some of the songs are like 8 minutes long, and they're only 8 minutes long because that was like the excitement over the riffs in the band, and it was like, oh, we got to do that now. And so the song
Yeah.
goes from 6 minutes to 8 minutes. And yeah, let's throw in a psychedelic part or kind of a post rock part, and that's usually just to serve the song, but most of the time it's just us having fun.
Yeah.
And my job is, I feel like my job in the band is kind of just to sort of like, okay, like how do we stitch it all together and just keep it coherent, right?
Hmm.
So it's like, okay, this we did have the 7 songs on this new record. We had closer to like 11.
Mm.
And like a few of the songs, it was just like this song just keeps fucking going on and on for no reason. So we just like, okay, let's just like shelve some of the riffs and just keep them for later. Like that was dope. Let's hang on to that.
Yeah.
But like this song is not going on the record because it's 8 minutes long and it's got nothing to say. It's like
Yeah.
musically, it's just like this part followed by this part followed by this part. And it was probably just one of the times we were in the jam space and had like too many beers and we're just getting stoked on ourselves. And,
Yeah.
I feel like the reason why this record has 7 songs instead of whatever 10 is because these are the songs that make the most sense to us. Yeah.
Hmm. And when you're putting together a record that does play with a lot of sounds, how do you strategize, piecing it together and kind of like creating ways for it all to kind of flow together cohesively and in a way that makes sense, in a way that seems like have a beginning and a middle and end as an album,
From song to song or within the song.
from song to song.
Yeah. Uh, well, okay. So with Year of Sleep, obviously that I would say the centerpiece of that record is the song itself, Year of Sleep. And that's kind of the one of the slower songs that's also kind of about 10 minutes long. And
Yeah.
um, I guess for continuity's sake, the big song on Yun is A Depth Charge in a Dead Sea, and that's
Mm.
that clocks in at 13 minutes. And
Yeah.
both of those songs are the third song on the record. So maybe that's our thing. It just ended up making sense. But I do always try to have like a narrative, like um, and then and I guess sorry, thematically a narrative, and then I
Hmm.
guess even going back to like your first alternative records that you listened to when you were like a kid, it's like I think the first song is always kind of a punch up. The second song is kind of usually like the single, and then you kind of take a moment here, not a sag, but like I don't know, I like albums, I like records that feel like an album. And then, but so by the time you're done, you're able to go back and kind of experience that all over again. Um, I think I answered that question okay.
I mean, the first
Just
thing
kind
that
of
came to my mind when you said that was like, well, obviously Nirvana's Nevermind, starting with Smells Like Teen Spirit, but then finally finding a way to end with Something in the Way, and it all kind of works.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean
I
on yeah, I don't know if you've heard the whole record yet. I don't know if
have,
you
yeah.
had an advanced copy, but Old Dogs is kind of our Something in the Way.
Okay.
I'd never put it in those words, but I'm gonna give you credit for that because that was a weird one. It was definitely I'd had that song in the chamber since 2014,
Mm,
and it was kind of just fully written, and it was intentionally sort of left almost wordless. It just had the two verses that just said kind of what it needed to say without really much illustration. The lyrics are very plain spoken in that song,
mm.
and that was kind of right around the time I'd lost my sister in 2013, and I'd lost my father the following year. So that song was just kind of what was coming out of me at the time. And I kind of had to have conversations with like the bandmates and was like trying to get a clear sense of like whether or not they were cool with it.
Mm.
And thankfully, as I say, the guitar player and the bass player in Pyres have been with me since just about day one. So I felt like I was sort of seeking their blessing with that song. It's like this is the most different thing we've probably ever done. Are you guys okay to like hang your hat on this? And thankfully they were. They're like, you need to put it out, and we back it. We dig the
Yeah.
song, man. So
Mm.
but yeah, thank you. That's our Something in the Way.
Well, glad I could
I'm
provide that. That
stoked
was
on
just
that.
the first thing that came to my mind when you're writing rock records. That like, and you're talking about like a progression. Like, well, that album has a progression. You have your big, big, shot her around the world song at the beginning, and then you have your very moody,
Yeah,
kind of slow song. I mean, but in the middle of the record, you have Kurt exercising his demon, going from lithium to on a plane to all these
yeah,
just so many influences in there from like kind of more psychedelic, drain to
yeah,
more punk songs, I would
totally.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely like I think that's maybe why sometimes we affix like we throw sort of grunge in there as like an influence. It might not come out in our sound, excuse me, but
Yeah.
I don't know, sort of tonally. At least that's kind of how I kind of came up as a kid. And it's like we're discussing Nevermind and those
Yeah.
those records, and I think even just like song structure,
Yeah.
like our the first single off this record, Granular Flow, like has a big chorus with it's a big dumb chorus that you could sing along to, and it's like verse chorus solo bridge chorus. Like that's a grunge song. It doesn't sound like one, but that's how those songs are built sometimes.
I don't think I think it makes complete sense to bring up grunge in terms of talking to you about your band because I don't. First of all, I think bands like Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, they wouldn't sound like that if metal wasn't before. Like I think it's clearly informed by a lot of metal music,
uh,
and then afterwards,
Absolutely, yeah,
I think like a lot of more modern metal sounds owe a ton to like you think Dirt by Alice in Chains. That is a metal record. I mean, it's a grunge record, but
yeah,
it's also a metal
yeah,
record, and it clearly like stoner sludge bands. You could hear
yeah,
Dirt in that sound.
for sure, for sure. I mean, and I'm not ashamed to admit, like growing up as a kid, kind of like the trifecta of Gish, Siamese Dream, and Melancholy.
Mm-hmm.
Like those first three Smashing Pumpkins records. Like if you're doing a deep dive of that material and you're not just listening to like Today or 1979, there's like huge Melvins riffs all over
Yeah.
those records and stuff. Like at the time anyway, he was definitely listening to you know um, kind of like get Melvins and noise rock and kind of stoner metal and stuff, like especially kind of the towards the end of Melancholy. There's like just like these huge fucking riffs.
Oh yeah.
So that's like maybe it's just in kind of our DNA, especially like the guitar player and bass player and I. That's just how he grew up. So
Yeah, I've never talked this much about 90s grunge with the band, but I'm so into it. When you talk about like Siamese Dream, and there's the big records, the big tracks like Cherub Rock or Today, and obviously those are huge. But like you get into some of the deeper cuts, like I think my favorite track off that record is Mayonnaise. It's kind of this like longer. It's kind of taking them on more like a kind of a daisy experience for the band, and I
yeah,
love the
yeah,
diversity there. But also, we talk about something in the way, but somehow Smashing Pumpkins got away with Disarm, and it's incredible. It fits so perfectly on that record. It's just like this, like almost acoustic ballad with a crazy chord change, and it's so emotional and so
yeah, yeah,
ethereal
yeah.
almost.
It definitely kind of it hit the moment at the time, and I think like by that time, big soulful soaring songs with like an orchestra in the background were kind of like on their way out, right? Because that was like a power ballad thing, right?
Hmm.
Like that was more like the big Guns N' Roses opus with the orchestra and all that kind of shit, or a Bon Jovi or something. But that Disarm was like, it was grandiose in its presentation, but it was also stripped back in its the sort of the personal, the instrumentation, just like an acoustic guitar and a person, and then as the song grows, there's this grandiosity to it. But yeah, it's definitely of the moment for sure.
And that's an interesting thing because I'm thinking about that too. Like you listen to Something in the Way or Disarm, or another good example would be Nutshell by Alice in Chains. Um, Bands that like came in the early 90s and probably heard the concept of like the power ballad from like these 80s hair metal bands and like how awful they were, but like thinking we can still make a slower, more personal song, but keep it feeling like it's not a cash grab. Like it's not just us trying to put a quote unquote slow song. Like it still feels like an Alice in Chains song. It's still very much you have that hurt, you
Sure.
have that darkness in it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm thinking of like Hunger Strike, like Temple of the Dog or something too, um, which is like also pretty overwrought. That was like the tail end of power ballad as power
Yeah.
ballads were dying out. But I think it was like the last great power ballad.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, um, do you plan, first of all, in this, do all of you have like within like let's say these past 12 years, have y'all worked on other bands? Do you have other projects?
I've always had a few projects. I was singing in a kind of a sort of a hardcore band for a while there.
Mhm.
That they were trying to sort of pick it back up with a new singer, and that was me. And they sort of gave me 10 songs to write lyrics to, and we had a lot of fun and we played a couple shows.
Yeah,
Um, but I don't think the band itself, maybe this I brought up maybe a necessary energy to the project, but I don't think that band was gonna. They just kind of couldn't gel, and
sure.
love the dudes. It was just a really great time. There's a record that we were gonna do that was shelved. I am playing bass in kind of like a fuzz 70s glam power pop rock and roll kind of
Oh,
emo
okay.
punk band, right? Yeah.
Like kind of
The
like the
band's
New York Dolls or something?
yeah, with a little bit of yeah, I mean sort of psych fuzz freak kind of stuff there. Not yeah.
Sure.
A little less Max's Kansas City, and a little more sort of overkill Motorhead in there as well.
Okay.
But
Okay.
we're actually playing a show tonight, so
Hell yeah.
I'm getting ready. I'm getting ready for that, and that's fun. That's guys, kind of veterans, scene veterans who've been kind of in the sort of the psych rock and the
Mm.
indie and rock and roll scene for a long time. So um, I was brought on to kind of help them play a few shows, and I just stuck with it because it's a fun time. It's just straight up rock and roll, and I get to play bass, which is different and fun.
Mhm. I
Yeah,
also play bass. It's a fun instrument.
yeah. I
Yeah.
actually have more bass guitars behind me than I do guitars. Weirdly enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and lastly, with Yun and with Pyres. Do you plan on playing live in support of the record?
We currently have like uh, about just under kind of a half dozen shows lined up for the summer,
Okay.
and so, there's a very cool thing that's happening in June with a ton of great bands, and I don't know if I'm supposed to announce it yet, but that's going to be super sick.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Is it going to be in Toronto?
It's outside of Toronto. Don't know exactly where on the map it is, but I can say it's going to be on an Air Force base, so that's pretty sick. And that's
I'm
kind of bringing in a lot of bands from all over the area, and some from the U.S. as well.
wicked. Okay. I'm excited to hear what this is. I won't ask you to
Yeah,
spoil anything that you can't spoil. So,
I think there's a rollout. There's a rollout.
yeah. Cool. Um, well, before I let you go, I want to give you the floor for any last words. Tell people where they can find your music, your socials, all the plugs. Go for it.
Okay, cool. First place to check us out, the band is going to be at Pyres_burn on Instagram. That's going
Okay.
to be where we're most active. We just put the time in. It does the thing that it needs to do. And then it's going to be hypaethralrecords.bandcamp.com. That's the shop, the first place you should look if you want to order the vinyl. There's a sick like orange and bone colored variant CD. Um, and so you can download the record there, of course, as well as all the other bands on the roster. It's a super diverse roster of bands on
Mhm.
Hypaethral. And then yeah, we're not too active on Twitter anymore for obvious reasons. But yeah, Instagram is where you want to reach out to the band directly, or kind of interface with us, and then check out hypaethralrecords.bandcamp.com. If you're
Yeah.
stoked on the music, that's where you can get the physical stuff.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. As always, thank you to my patrons to keep the show running. My name is Maddie, aka Beaver Mosh. You watching at home, keep it metal. And we're out of here. Bye.